According to Chinese government statistics, the economy grew at 5.2% in 2023. There are numerous challenges: weak consumer confidence, mounting local government debt, and a real estate market that used to fuel the economy but is now in a prolonged downturn. Many economists, including some in China, advocate that the government stimulate consumer spending. It's clear, however, that Xi Jinping is pursuing a different strategy. And this was quite clear when Chinese Premier Li Qiang delivered the government work report last March. My guest today, Tanner Greer, argued in a recent article published in Foreign Policy and in his blog, The Scholar's Stage, that Xi Jinping and the Politburo believe that science and technology are the answer to China's problems. To quote from the article, the central task of the Chinese state is to build an industrial and scientific system capable of pushing humanity to new technological frontiers. I'm delighted that Tanner is joining me to discuss his analysis and its implications. Tanner is the director of the Center for Strategic Translation. As a journalist and researcher, his writing focuses on world politics and history. Thanks so much for doing the podcast today, Tanner.
Thank you for having me on.
So, what is the historical narrative that informs China's belief that science and technology and what you refer to as techno-industrial policy is the best prescription to solve their economic woes?
Yeah, sure. So that's sort of what our essay tries to get at. A lot of people have noticed lately that science and tech policy in China has both become the focus of industrial policy and the focus of really much Chinese policy as a whole. And this can be explained both by reference to recent historical events and a broader narrative that has a lot of currency with Chinese intellectuals and elites in the Communist Party of China, including Xi Jinping himself. And the basic version of this narrative is that when you look at the rise and fall of great powers over the last 300, 400 years of history, the most important variable is science and technology. The countries that utilize and take advantage of dramatic transition points, such as the Industrial Revolution. The countries that do that leap ahead of the other countries in the world. The United States leads the computer revolution. England leads the Industrial Revolution with steam power. And this leads to them to both having vastly larger economies than other ones around them, as well as much greater national power in the hard power sense. And so it's that's the narrative in a nutshell. These conclusions that if China is going to advance ahead in the world, it needs to be to the 21st century, what Britain was to the first industrial revolution, or what America was to the digital revolution. That's the foundation of this narrative.
So how does China's own history fit into the narrative?
Well, so this idea set is in many ways quite old. Elements that go back all the way to the 1910s, when Chinese intellectuals are trying to figure out what's wrong with our country. How come imperialists are inside our borders? We're ridden by civil wars, and these comparatively tiny countries, England, France, whatever, can take advantage of us. And one of the answers they come up with is that we missed this round of technological competition, this round of scientific advance. And they had different versions of it. A lot of the people in the 1910s would focus on Confucianism and the problems of Chinese culture. Those parts maybe have a little bit less resonance today than the general conclusion that the Qing dynasty lost the Opium War and fell into disrepute and then lost a war against Japan, largely because it was not able to modernize the way that first Europe and then Japan was. And so Chinese people looking at their own history from this period of, sometimes Chinese intellectuals will call this the century of national humiliation, this period of time between the Opium Wars and about World War II. They say China fell behind. Chinese school children learn a phrase. They say those who fall behind get beaten, like as in physically hit. And that's the lesson they take from those years. And then when they look at more recent history, when they look at, say, Deng Xiaoping to now, Deng Xiaoping comes onto the national leadership scene, trying to promote the four modernizations, as he called it, that this is what the Chinese state should orient itself around. And you can look at the fantastic economic growth of the last few decades as a process of moving from villages to skyscrapers, animal power to electricity and nuclear power. And they look at the tremendous gains in both hard power and wealth they've had. And they say, well, yeah, this is a story of us adapting existing technology and incorporating it into our society. This is how great powers rise without conflict or the need for military conflict. But now they're at the point where it's no longer enough to simply adapt Western technologies that have existed. They're not so concerned with just playing catch up, but also with becoming a leader in new technological frontiers.
Is this really new under Xi Jinping? And I know you've dug into a lot of his writings and speeches. What have you found that is evidence that you can perhaps just give us some examples that Xi Jinping believes that technological revolutions profoundly change the global political order?
Well, so elements of them new and elements are not. Like Chinese communists have been concerned about the role that technology and science will play since the very beginning. The founder of the Communist Party of China, Chen Duxiu, in 1919 writes an essay about how Mr. Science is one of the things that China needs to be saved. And there are elements of current policy, such as this idea that you can have an industrial policy that's focused on emerging technologies that date back to, say, 2006. What really starts to change with Xi Jinping is a growing sense that we have entered a historical moment. In Chinese, the phrase they use for this moment, in the Chinese propaganda, they call it a new round of scientific revolution and industrial transformation. That we are entering this moment in time where, just like, say, with the Industrial Revolution, where you had this huge sweep of new technologies which completely transformed the existing economy, or in the Digital Revolution, or in the introduction of electricity and electrification in the late 19th century, you have these transition points, these moments where the existing economic order is about to be overturned. And those who can get in on the early stages of this overturning will reap disproportionate benefits. And Xi Jinping talks about this all the time. Every few years, he gives a speech to the Academician Conference of Chinese Engineers and Scientists, and he always includes a few paragraphs about this idea, where he more or less says, look, we are in this moment, and there's a good chance that we will fall behind and lose like a generation's worth of growth if we do not help take advantage of this moment. And if we look at the past, the countries that do take advantage of it, they have commensurate gains in what he calls composite national power or comprehensive national power, depending on how you want to translate it. And so this is very common. You can see it in many of his speeches. You see it he wrote an essay for Qiushi magazine in 2021, that outlines this idea as well. I have individual quotes I could read for you, but if you follow Xi closely, this is a common problem set that he thinks we have, that we're entering this moment in time when it really matters. It's not sufficient to just kind of follow. You have to lead or you'll be left behind.
China's assessment is that the United States is in inexorable decline. The West is in decline and China is on the rise. In the early 2000s, I'm sure you remember that Chinese experts used to do in-depth assessments of their comprehensive national power relative to the United States and other countries. My sense is they don't do this any longer, but maybe I'm wrong. Do you have any sense as to how the Chinese Communist Party today assesses the global balance of power and China's own position in it?
Yeah, well, some intellectuals still do. In fact, 2 months ago, we published a translation of an economist who's associated with the National Development Reform Commission in China, which is the organization in China that develops that's in charge of development planning. And he wrote this book called China 2050 Assessments of Composite National Power, where he tries to mathematically figure out what is the assessment today and what will it be in 2050 if we do different things. And his assessment of China at the moment is actually quite negative. He views that Chinese technology is not there yet. And he openly writes in this book, and we won't accomplish everything we want to do by this magical 2050 date, when all the great things that Xi Jinping says is supposed to happen will happen, unless we can become technological leaders. That's one of the lessons of that particular assessment. Xi Jinping, for his part, he often talks about the shortcomings of the existing, what he calls the innovation system. That there's not enough connection between academics doing basic research and people doing working on practical applications, that their market incentives haven't been given enough of a role in the development of new technologies and so forth. But he also believes, and he emphasizes this in his speeches as well, that China has a lot of strengths. And you'll look at Chinese intellectuals and they'll cite things like, at the moment we are, publishing more scientific papers than any other country in the world. We have the second highest concentration of PhDs in this engineering topic or that engineering topic. And so I think their view is that in this core variable of science and technology, they are behind the United States. But they think it's reasonable and necessary that over the next 15, 20 years, that flips. Their plans for economic growth in some ways depend on this happening, or at least them equaling the United States, becoming what they call a world leader in techno-scientific advance.
You argue in your foreign policy article that China's techno-nationalist drive is premised on 3 ideas. Can you just explain briefly what those ideas are and why they matter?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so the basic first one is that when you look at the various elements of national power or national success, science and technology is the most fundamental. Economic and military power are downstream from that. And that's important because that's not necessarily obvious. There's lots of other things you could look at. You could look at national cohesion. You could look at the population size. You could look at the number of allies you have. But when when a lot of the Chinese researchers that we have looked at, when they're trying to figure out rise and fall of great powers, they don't talk about, say, the kind of things Henry Kissinger would in his book Diplomacy, where it's about grand machinations and strategy. No, they say it's technology, science matters most. So the second most important idea in this narrative is that science and technology does not just increase at this steady pace. There are certain moments, revolutionary moments, transitions that matter more than others. And then the third one is that sort of transition is happening right now. And so the obvious implication for all this is that if science and technology is the most important element of national power, that there are certain moments in time when great leaps happen, and that leap is happening right now, well, then China needs to be leading that leap. Otherwise, it will fall behind.
How has the intensification of technology competition between the United States and China actually influenced Chinese policy under Xi Jinping?
Well, I think it's influenced it profoundly. I've emphasized thus far kind of the idea set and the historical narrative that leads to this new emphasis on kind of techno-scientific industrial policy. But there's a set of practical things that happen that make this issue much more salient in the minds of Chinese policymakers. There's an economic track and maybe a security track. The economic track is that the old model they used for economic growth, which involved a lot of investment in infrastructure. That's kind of how they powered through the Great Recession. It's how most of the growth they had in the 2010s. They just go and build buildings and railroads and sewer systems. That has reached the point of limited returns. At the same time, Xi Jinping has since 2014, talked more and more about how we need to have a security mindset in many other fields other than national defense in a narrow sense. We need to be able to think about security when it comes to economics and the autonomy of the Communist Party. And so he comes in with this set of ideas. And it's not necessarily true that everyone in China agrees with him. The Howard Wong, a researcher at RAND, has a good paper on this where he kind of tracks how when Xi Jinping introduces this idea, the economic organs of Chinese policymaking do not start to echo his calls for a focus on self-sufficiency and economic security until 2017, 2018. And partly that might be Xi Jinping growing in power, but partially that's America starts a trade war. America starts putting in these tech restrictions. And a lot of Chinese people who come from a more economics background start taking this view of Xi Jinping more seriously. Actually, yes, there is a real threat. We might be cut off from what we believe is the foundation to China's long-term economic growth over the next few decades. And so it's the combination of the faltering economy with this more securitized atmosphere, partially in response to American actions, that I think sets the stage for this kind of techno-nationalist industrial policy to become the key thing the Chinese state is working on. Because it seems to be an answer to both problem sets. We can technologically secure our supply chains, we can provide ourselves with a new way for economic growth, and it's hitting two birds with one stone.
So do you think Chinese policies that are aimed at modernizing the industrial system, accelerating the development of what Xi Jinping now calls new high-quality productive forces, are these actually bearing fruit? Can we already see signs of where these policies are working and maybe where they are not working so far?
Well, so that particular slogan about new productive forces was only introduced last October, I believe. And many of these new efforts that they're trying to do are actually quite new, right? This idea that the central focus of what the government should be working on is all of this has really only been publicly announced since last December in the Central Economic Work Conference that China had at that point. But many of the predecessor policies that have been enacted since around 2016, when Xi Jinping first starts talking about, scientific revolutions and how this needs to be our keystone of our economic approach, you could certainly say some of them have succeeded. Certainly, China is a leader in certain key sectors that he identified all the way back then as key to this new revolution, such as green energy, or if you look at Chinese EV sales and the industrial policies that helped create that, that is a part of this whole process. But I think most Chinese and most observers from outside would say it's really too early to tell. Most of this stuff is being introduced now, and a lot of the big reforms that Xi wants to do that involve setting up new labs and research centers and kind of systems of collaboration between private enterprise and academics and the state have only really come together since 2020. And the measure of their success might take a decade or two. It's not necessarily fast for technologies to go from fundamental developments and new science to the innovation of a new technology to that diffusion of that new technology across a country. I think it's too early to really tell whether or not it's going to work out as well as they hope.
Now, you wrote in your blog that you are somewhat skeptical that China's strategy will work. So what's your reasoning?
Well, I have a few reservations. I don't want to say that it will not work. And I'll also preface with saying I'm not an economist. In as much as I have expertise, it's more in just trying to understand how these slogans and ideas all fit together at the large national scale. We look at lots of things other than the economy. But I have a few reservations about their their strategy, many of which don't seem to be voiced that often in China. The first is that this plan is predicated on essentially two bets working out. The first is that you actually are in the moment of transformative technological change equivalent to the Industrial Revolution. And by the Chinese own account, this happens like once every century. And so if we're not actually in such a moment, if the suite of technologies that they've identified don't actually have the potential to revolutionize the world economy, then they might be putting a lot of investments into something that won't produce what they're hoping. And then likewise, even if they have correctly identified the historical moment we're in, that doesn't necessarily mean they will be the ones who successfully lead it. And again, one of the questions you kind of have to ask is, what is the opportunity cost of this sort of policy? And in this case, I think looking at the example of past communist regimes is somewhat interesting, because the Communist Party of China is not the first communist regime to stake its economic future on a new techno-scientific revolution. There's two examples that I think illustrate two different modes of failure of where this could go wrong. The first one is the Eastern Bloc in the 1970s, 1980s, where they basically said a lot of, in the late 60s and early 70s, many parts of the Eastern Bloc, Germany, Poland, and so forth, they thought if we can do a proper round of industrial upgrading, we can become an industrial manufacturing center for the world for the next round of advanced production techniques. And they took a lot of debt in order to finance this potential future. It turned out they messed up. And a lot of the problems you have in the 1980s when these communist regimes fall happen because these countries are now in so much debt that they have to institute austerity measures on their own populace, reduce their consumption rates. There's a lot of discontent, and it leads to the Berlin Wall falling down. So that's one failure mode, is you make investments and then they don't turn out, and you're left with a lot of money that you have to pay back. The other one is what happens in the Soviet Union. The Soviets also had a very similar phrase. They talked about a global techno-scientific revolution. I don't think they added the phrase "an industrial transformation" to it. And they thought that, we need to lead the, basically what we would call the digital revolution. And they also kind of struggled to do so. But there are certain economists who've written about this, and they say the real problem with the Soviets wasn't just that they couldn't develop these technologies, but that by focusing so much on this technological utopianism, that, if we can grow out of our problems, if we can just stumble upon these new technologies and have new growth rates return, we can grow out of our problems. It was a way for conservatives under Brezhnev and stuff to avoid discussions of more immediate and painful reforms that the Soviet system might have needed. And that as long as you had the hope of this technological revolution, you could continue to defer those to the future. And eventually those problems came to swallow the Soviet economy. And so that's another possible failure mechanism that we could see here. Perhaps the Chinese will focus on this, they'll chase this chimera, and if it doesn't pan out, then a lot of the other more traditional problems that economists have identified, and that even the Chinese party has identified, things like the real estate bubble, or especially the need to increase consumer demand within China. If those problems take second fiddle, it could be that if the bets don't work out, they will still be there and might be worse. And so I'm not saying that is what will happen, just that this is a strong, this is certainly a possibility of what could happen. And I very rarely do I see discussions in the Chinese analysis that focus on these case studies of attempting to do a scientific revolution and failing. They mostly focus on the countries they felt like did it right. United States above all.
That's interesting, though, because, of course, the Chinese have studied the Soviet experience ad nauseum.
Well, yes, they have. And it's very interesting. They're obsessively studied it, in fact. But certain theories are more popular than others. Xi Jinping, one of the very first speeches he gives when he is elected, or not elected, when he's elevated to General Secretary of the Communist Party of China, he gives a speech on the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and its lessons to be learned from that for China. And like one of the things he says is, why did the Soviet Union fall? Because ideological competition is fierce. His preferred version is that they fell because the party members stopped believing. The party members were affected by kind of anti-Stalinism. They became corrupt. And if you look at his policies, things like the anti-corruption campaign and the whole campaign on sticking to our original intentions, these are campaigns to try and educate and give a patriotic and pro-party sentiment, mostly in the party members themselves. That's the overriding lesson he thinks should be learned from the collapse of the Soviet Union. And there's been many, many popular presentations, documentaries that have been shown to cadres that tell this story. And that story isn't immune to like technological elements. They will emphasize that had the economy of the Soviet Union done better, that a lot of their problems would have been avoided. But the lesson that Xi Jinping himself wants the party to learn from it is not about science and technology. And so this might be actually in some ways a reflection of his personal obsessions. Though I can't be 100% sure of that.
Sounds like reasonable speculation. Finally, since you obviously read a great deal of what the Chinese write about Xi Jinping and his policies, do you see any evidence of Chinese intellectuals? I know it's early days, but are they writing about this techno-industrial strategy? Are they only championing it and echoing what Xi Jinping says? Or do you see any evidence that some are questioning it?
Well, I mean, I would say that a large number are for it. And not just because, like, oh, Xi Jinping said it, so we have to say it too. I think a large number of Chinese, especially development economists and people in the Chinese system who come from a development economic background, like development economics is all about the application of new technologies to less developed systems. That's what development kind of means, really. But you can find, I tend to find that the voices that are most cautious or that push back against this policy set the most tend to be either liberals or like economic finance types. A good example of this is specialists in finance economics. A good example of this is Zhang Jun, who is the dean of economics at Fudan University. He wrote an essay a month or two ago. It was translated on the Substack East is Red. So people who don't read Chinese can go find it. And what he says there, he basically, like, he doesn't come outright and say, no, this is wrong. But what he does say is what we need now is more domestic consumption. We should be considering raising pensions. We should be considering all these other ways in which we'll do that. And we should be considering less putting more money into state-led investments. And this is an implicit criticism of this approach. And that's not that dissimilar from what a lot of Western economists are saying. And I think their critique rests on two ideas. The first one is that many of these techno-scientific goals might lead to big changes down the line, but not tomorrow. And the problems that we have maybe need to be addressed tomorrow. And then there's also just a bigger sense that there's a lot of wondering whether or not this will be sufficient to actually work for an economy the scale of China's. It's one thing for a South Korea or a Taiwan to have a few industrial champions oriented around a few high-tech industries that can kind of pull the whole country forward. But China's gigantic. And you have entire provinces with 20 million. Gansu has 25 million people and a GDP per capita similar to the Dominican Republic. And unless you can create a sort of cycle of demand that reaches those places that are far from the seaboard, that are far from the existing industrial centers, this might not be sufficient. And so that's I think some of the ideas that lie behind their reservations of both the Chinese and the Westerners who are skeptical that this might work. Maybe it's not properly scaled to an economy the size of China. Maybe a second concern would also be that this might be harder for China to do than it seems because of the development gaps within China. Most countries that leave the middle income gap have very highly educated populace. Scott Rozelle has a good book called Invisible China that talks about how there's a huge number of Chinese who don't have, high school degrees. And if you're trying to reorient your economy around high-tech manufacturing, you need a highly educated workforce to do this. And so that's, I think, the other danger. And the Chinese themselves are aware of this. This is why, when you look at how they talk about techno-industrial policy, they always talk about the need to cultivate talent. In many ways, they view this as an education problem. And that's not just, we need to make sure we have enough people going to America and learning high-end, engineering skills. It's also, we need to increase the number of Chinese who have high school diplomas. Because otherwise, this is not something that we will succeed in. And so the challenges are real. I don't think it's like a foregone conclusion that China will be able to do this. And neither does Xi Jinping. But he wants to orient all the state around making sure that it happens. Because he thinks probably that these challenges are large enough that if you don't have that level of effort, it might not happen.
Well, I think Xi Jinping sees this as the real secret to achieving national rejuvenation or putting China on this inexorable path to national rejuvenation.